The puck dropped at 7:30, same as it always did on hockey night in Canada. And I had just settled into my armchair with a cup of tea when my daughter-in-law walked across the room and switched the television off. Not changed the channel, switched it off. She didn't look at me. Just reached across, hit the power button on the side of the set, and said, "We've got people coming over later. We'll need the living room." The screen went dark. The Leafs had been up by 1. I looked toward the kitchen. My son was standing at the counter, scrolling through his phone. He'd heard every word. He was maybe 10 feet away. He looked up for exactly 1 second, then looked back down at the screen. Nobody said anything else. I set my mug on the side table. The ceramic made a small sound against the coaster. The one my wife had bought at a craft fair in Prince Edward County back in 2017. She'd bought a set of 4. 3 were still in the cabinet. This one had been sitting on that table for 2 years. I got up from the chair. My right knee has been complaining since I came off a roof wrong in 2019, and it announced itself immediately on the way to standing. I walked down the hall to the bedroom. Nobody called after me. Nobody knocked. Nobody even acknowledged what had just happened in the room I'd owned for 28 years. I sat on the edge of the bed. The house was quiet, except for the muffled sound of my daughter-in-law in the kitchen, opening and closing the refrigerator like she was looking for something and not finding it. A cupboard. The tap. Normal sounds. Life moving on without any particular need to consider me. I looked at the photograph on the nightstand. My wife laughing at something I'd said, taken on the dock at a friend's camp up near Sharbot Lake. The light behind her was the kind of August light you only get in Eastern Ontario, warm and slow, like it doesn't want to leave. She hadn't wanted to leave either. But cancer doesn't negotiate. She'd been gone 26 months. Well, I said to the photograph, I guess we've gotten to that part. She would have handled it differently. She wouldn't have raised her voice. She wouldn't have made a scene. But she had a way of looking at people that made them remember who they were. One quiet look from her, and my son would have put his phone down and said something. One look, and my daughter-in-law would have turned the television back on and apologized. Instead, I sat there listening to the refrigerator hum through the wall. I am 63 years old. I spent 37 years as a licensed electrician in this city, working jobs from renovation crawl spaces in January to commercial builds in summer heat. My knees know every one of those years. So do my hands. I retired 2 years ago, 2 months after my wife's diagnosis, because we wanted time together. We got 6 months of it. Then I got the rest of it alone. The house is mine. Has been since 1996. I built the deck myself, poured the concrete for the garage pad with a friend, painted every room twice over the decades. Once with my wife choosing the colors, once after she was gone, and the walls needed something different to look at. It is my house. That was never in question. But sitting there that night, it didn't feel that way anymore. I should have seen the shift coming before the television went dark. Honestly, if I'm telling this right, the television wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment I stopped convincing myself that things weren't as bad as they looked. My son called me on a Thursday evening in October of last year. I remember because the leaves on the silver maple out front had just hit their peak, that deep orange that only lasts about 4 days before they drop. I was raking. He sounded careful. The way people sound when they already know the answer is probably yes, but feel bad asking. He explained things in stages. The apartment building in Toronto had sold to new owners. Rent was going up. Way up. He and my daughter-in-law were between leases. His hours at the logistics company had been cut. Could they stay? Just until they got sorted. Probably 3 months. 4 at the outside. I didn't think twice. Of course. Come home. I remember the relief in his voice. I remember feeling like I'd done something useful. After his mother died, the house had gotten very quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Some nights I'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner and just not do anything. Not even watch television. Just sit there. The house made sounds, pipes, settling, wind against the back window. but none of them were the right sounds. So when my son and daughter-in-law pulled into the driveway that November with 2 carloads and a rented trailer, I was genuinely glad to see them. Even the trailer. The first month was fine. The second was mostly fine. Then the third month arrived, and I started noticing things. Small things at first. The kind you almost talk yourself out of mentioning. The kitchen reorganized without asking. I reached for the coffee filters where they'd lived for 15 years and found dish towels instead. When I mentioned it, my daughter-in-law said she'd made the cupboard more efficient. She smiled when she said it. She was often smiling. A few weeks later, my wife's collection of small pottery pieces, local artists, pieces she'd picked up at the Kingston Artist Studio tour over the years, the kind of thing nobody else would care about but us, disappeared from the windowsill in the living room. I found them in a box in the storage room off the laundry, neatly wrapped, like things that no longer mattered. I stood there in that storage room for a long time. When I mentioned it to my daughter-in-law, she said the windowsill looked cleaner without things on it. She wasn't unkind about it. That was the thing. She was almost never unkind about any of it. She just decided. And the decisions accumulated. My son's response was the same response he gave to most things those days. "It's not a big deal, Dad," said gently. He was always gentle about it. "She's just trying to make it feel like home. Her home, not mine." I let it go. I had been letting a lot of things go by then. I tried once clearly, once that counted, to say something early. In December, I came home to find the spare key I kept hanging by the back door was gone. My daughter-in-law had taken it to make a copy for a friend stopping by while they were out. She hadn't asked. When I said quietly that I'd prefer to know before keys to the house got duplicated, she looked at me with a polite expression that somehow also managed to convey that I was being a bit much. My son, standing in the doorway behind her, said, "Dad, she didn't mean anything by it." I nodded. I let it go. That became the pattern. I noticed. I said something once, carefully. My son smoothed it over. My daughter-in-law smiled, and life moved on without ever actually addressing anything. By February, I had started spending more time in my workshop, a small outbuilding at the back of the property, heated by an old propane unit. It smells like sawdust and machine oil and 30 years of projects. My wife used to joke that I retreated there whenever I needed to think. She wasn't wrong. One afternoon, I found myself staring at the wall where I kept photographs pinned up. Work photos, mostly. Some from camping trips. One of my son at 11, holding a fish he'd caught at a lake north of Bancroft. He was grinning in that way kids grin when they've done something they didn't think they could do. I remembered standing in that boat with him. The way the morning came in, flat across the water. The way he kept checking to see if the line was moving. That 11-year-old would have said something. That 11-year-old would have marched out to the living room and told whoever was bothering his father to knock it right off. I missed him. More than I'd realized until that moment. The moment that removed every remaining doubt came on a Tuesday, in March, 2 weeks before the television. I was looking through Kijiji. I check it sometimes for tools, when I found a listing. A small oil painting, landscape, rolling fields, a barn in the middle distance, soft winter light across everything. I recognized it immediately. My wife had painted it. She took a watercolor class years ago and eventually switched to oils. She painted maybe 12, 15 pieces over 10 years. Nothing professional. Just something she loved. That painting had been hanging in the upstairs hallway since 2014. Seller listed, my daughter-in-law's name, $40. I sat at the kitchen table and didn't move for a while. Then I went upstairs. The hallway was bare where the painting had been. I checked the storage room. I found 3 more of my wife's paintings, wrapped in newspaper, stacked against the wall, and a small jade plant my wife had grown from a single cutting, now sitting on the windowsill in the guest room as though it had always been there, with no memory of who had tended it for 12 years. I didn't say anything that night. I needed to think before I acted. 3 days later, the television went off during the Leafs game. And my daughter-in-law walked out of the room without a backward glance, and I sat in the quiet for a moment before I got up and went to find my phone. I called my friend the next morning. We've been friends since we worked the same union hall in the late 80s, and he has never in 35 years told me what I wanted to hear when what I needed to hear was something harder. That is an underrated quality in a person. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is more difficult than people tend to give it credit for. When I finished, he said, "Have you talked to anyone legal about this?" I had not. "You should," he said, before anything else. I called a solicitor that afternoon. She came recommended through my union's Retired Members Association, which keeps a list of professionals for situations like this. She had a calm, practical manner and spoke to me like someone who assumed I was capable of understanding plain language. I appreciated that. She said something I needed to hear. "This is your property. You have rights here that haven't changed simply because people are living in your house." I asked her to look into the Kijiji listings specifically. She said she'd make some calls. 2 days later, she phoned back. Her voice had a new quality, still professional, but careful in a different way. She had spoken with a real estate agent in Kingston. The agent remembered the inquiry. Someone had reached out several months ago, she said, asking about the process for listing a property, specifically about whether both a homeowner and a long-term resident could be involved in the sale if the homeowner was elderly and the resident was a family member managing the household. My daughter-in-law had used my address. The solicitor paused to let me take that in. I was sitting in the workshop when she told me. The propane heater was running low. Outside, the last of the March snow was melting off the roof in slow drips. I thought about the real estate agent receiving that phone call. I thought about my daughter-in-law sitting somewhere, making calculations. Not from malice, maybe. Maybe from a fear that had grown into something she hadn't examined carefully enough. But calculating nonetheless. I thought about my wife, who had grown the jade plant from a single cutting, watered it for 12 years, and left it behind when she went, as something that would keep growing after her. "What do I do?" I asked. The solicitor told me. I gave myself 1 week to be certain, not because I doubted what I'd found, because I wanted to act from my head, not my chest. During that week, I spoke with my neighbor across the street. She had lived there since before I bought the house and had known my wife from the hospital auxiliary they both volunteered with. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything and commented on very little, which I had come to respect deeply in 30 years of living across from her. She confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. She'd had a conversation with my daughter-in-law at the mailboxes in January. My daughter-in-law had mentioned, in an offhand way, that they were looking after me, that the house was a lot for one person to manage. I am 63. I had replaced my own electrical panel the previous spring. At the end of that week, I made a decision. I called my son. Some people, when they hear this kind of story, think I should have called a locksmith or changed the locks while they were at work. I understand why people feel that way. But I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in stopping something. Those are not the same thing, and mixing them up tends to make both harder. My son answered on the second ring. He sounded the way he'd sounded for months. Uncertain, slightly braced, never quite at ease. "I need you to come home," I said. "Just you tonight. I need to talk." A pause. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," I said, "but we're going to sort it out." He came home at 7. My daughter-in-law was at her sister's, which was not a coincidence. I'd made sure of that. This particular conversation needed to happen in the right order. We sat at the kitchen table. I put the kettle on. Old habit. It gives your hands something to do while your mind does the harder work. I told him what I knew. The real estate inquiry, the Kijiji listing, the paintings, the jade plant. I told him calmly, in order, without editorializing. I've found that by 63, you either understand that raising your voice rarely accomplishes what you need it to, or you haven't learned it yet. I watched my son's face change as I talked. By the time I got to the real estate inquiry, he had stopped looking at me and was staring at the table. By the time I finished, he looked like someone who had been walking confidently towards something and had just discovered the ground ahead of him was not what he'd assumed. He didn't defend her. I noticed that. He said very quietly, "I didn't know." I believed him. Partly because I'd known my son his whole life, and partly because the look on his face didn't leave room for anything except genuine shock. "I know you didn't," I said. "Dad, He stopped. Started again. "I should have said something, a long time ago. I knew things were off. I kept telling myself it wasn't worth making it into something. There it was. Keeping the peace, mistaken for peace itself. I've made that mistake in my own life. Most people have. The instinct to smooth things over, to hold the room together, to keep everyone comfortable. It's not a bad instinct. It just has a cost. And the cost rarely lands on the person doing the smoothing. It lands on whoever is least likely to push back. That person had become me. We talked for nearly 2 hours. My son cried at one point, which he hadn't done in front of me since he was a teenager. I didn't comment on it. I just kept the tea warm. At the end of it, I said what needed to be said. I told him I loved him. That I always would, that nothing that had happened changed that. I also told him that things needed to change, immediately, and that if they couldn't, we would be having a different conversation with my solicitor present. He nodded. He looked exhausted, in a way that was different from tired, more like someone who had stopped carrying something very heavy and was only now feeling how much it had weighed. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to be my son," I said. "Not a buffer, not a referee. My son." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Okay." The conversation with my daughter-in-law happened 3 days later. My solicitor was there, which some people might find harsh. Maybe it was. But I had learned, over several months, that conversations without witnesses tended to be remembered differently by different people afterward. I was done operating without witnesses. My neighbor came as well, at her own insistence. She brought butter tarts, which was so perfectly Ontario of her that I nearly smiled. My daughter-in-law arrived composed. She stayed that way through most of the first 20 minutes, while my solicitor laid out what had been found: the real estate inquiry, the Kijiji listings, the documentation. No accusations about intention, just facts, clearly stated. By the time the real estate inquiry came up, something in her composure had shifted. Not defensively, more like someone who has been carrying something she believed was private and has just understood that it wasn't. She looked at my son. He looked back at her without the expression she'd been getting from him for months, without the reassurance. She looked at me. For the first time since November, she actually looked at me. Not past me, not around me. She said, "I was scared. My neighbor passed the butter tarts. Nobody took one yet." My daughter-in-law talked for a while. About the Toronto rent, about debt she'd come in with that she hadn't fully told my son about the fear of never owning anything, of being her age with nothing solid underneath. She'd grown up watching her parents lose a house to a power of sale when she was 12 years old. She didn't say that to excuse herself. She said it to explain where the fear had originally come from, before it grew into something else. I believed her, not about everything, but about the fear. People don't have to be entirely bad to cause damage. They just have to be frightened enough to stop thinking clearly about who else is in the room. When she finished, my neighbor, who had not been asked to speak, leaned forward and said something I hadn't expected. She said, "Do you know what your mother-in-law was like?" My daughter-in-law looked up, caught off guard. "A little, from what Jason has told me." My neighbor nodded slowly. She worried about everyone except herself. For 40 years. She looked at me, then back. He is exactly the same. And people who are like that don't stop. They just get quieter and quieter until someone finally notices they've gone completely silent. Nobody spoke. My daughter-in-law looked at the table. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the jade plant. I thought about the painting on Kijiji. $40. I thought about the television going dark in the middle of the third period and my son looking up from his phone for exactly 1 second, before looking back down. I know, I said, and I meant it. I believed the apology was real. I also knew that real apologies don't restore what was lost. They're a starting point, not a conclusion. I told them what I needed. 60 days to find another place to live. My solicitor would handle an agreement about the personal property. The paintings and the jade plant would be returned immediately to where they belonged. The Kijiji listing would be taken down. And going forward for however long they remained, certain things would be understood without ambiguity. What was mine was mine. The decisions about this property were mine alone. That would not be unclear again. Nobody argued. Both of them nodded. My son reached across the table and put his hand on mine for a moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They were gone by mid-May. The move was quiet. No final arguments, no accusations, no last-minute scenes. Just boxes and furniture, and a truck in the driveway, and then the driveway empty. My son stayed behind for an hour after the truck left. He found me in the workshop, moving some things back where they belonged. We worked for a while without talking, the comfortable kind of not talking that takes years to build. At one point, he handed me a wrench I'd been looking for. At another point, he said, "I don't know how to fix this, Dad." I set down what I was holding. "Some things don't get fixed," I told him. "They get rebuilt. That's different." He thought about that for a moment. Then, "I'll keep showing up." "I know you will," I said. The first few weeks after they left were strange. Not exactly peaceful. Just different. I found the jade plant back on the kitchen windowsill, where it had lived since my wife propagated it from a cutting in 2011, and I stood there looking at it for a while before I put the kettle on. The house was mine again, quiet in the way it had been for 2 years before they arrived. But this time, the quiet felt like mine, not like a wound, not like an absence, just mine. My friend came over for the Leafs playoff game in April. He brought a thermos of coffee and a bag of chips, and we watched the whole thing in the living room without interruption. When Toronto inevitably broke our hearts in overtime, he shook his head slowly and said, "Every year." "Every year," I agreed. My son calls on Sundays now. We talk for 20 minutes, sometimes longer. Once a month, he comes by and we find something to work on around the house. Last week, it was the back gate, which had been sagging since the fall. We spent 2 hours on it, working mostly in silence, the way fathers and sons do when words would only get in the way. When we finished, he stood back and looked at it, then at me. "Looks good," he said. "Yup," I said. Simple, honest, enough. I'm not going to pretend everything is repaired. Trust doesn't come back at the same pace it leaves. My relationship with my daughter-in-law exists now at a careful distance. Polite, cautious, neither of us pretending it's more than that. Maybe that changes eventually. Maybe it doesn't. Some things take longer than 63 years allows. But on a Saturday afternoon in late May, I was sitting in my armchair, back in its proper spot near the window, where the afternoon light comes through the silver maple, and I realized I hadn't felt invisible in weeks. My wife's pottery was back on the living room windowsill. Her painting was back in the upstairs hallway. The jade plant was back in the kitchen, and it had put out 2 new leaves since spring. The remote was on the arm of the chair, a small strip of masking tape across the back, in permanent marker, in my own handwriting, because sometimes a small and private joke is worth more than it has any right to be. I settled in. I turned on the television. There are things worth protecting. Peace is one of them. And peace, I've learned, is not the same thing as silence. Sometimes it costs something to find it. Sometimes you have to hold your ground so quietly, so deliberately, that the people around you don't fully understand what you've done until it's already done. But it is worth finding, at 63, at any age. It is worth every bit of it.